The heavy aroma of fresh paint mingled with the murmurs of the crowd as Sophie Ellington stood at the edge of the exhibition hall. Her hands trembled slightly, though she masked it with a sip of her wine. Tonight was her chance, her first major gallery showing. Around her, sophisticated voices dissected the meaning behind her abstract works, but Sophie felt oddly detached from it all. Then she saw him. Tall, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, Khalid al-Mansour stood apart from the throng, his gaze fixed intently on one of her paintings. It was Elysium, her favorite, a chaotic blend of blues and golds that she had poured her soul into. There was something magnetic about him, a presence that seemed to draw others near while he remained focused, isolated within his own sphere. Sophie hesitated. Was it confidence or fear that pulled her feet toward him? "Your work is extraordinary," Khalid spoke, his deep voice resonating even in the crowded room. "The kind of brilliance that makes you question where the artist has been, what they've seen." Sophie blinked, unsure how to respond. "Thank you," she finally said, her voice almost too soft. "I suppose it reflects a little bit of everything." He turned to her, his gaze sharp yet inviting. "And what is everything to you?" The question caught her off guard. Most patrons only praised the aesthetics or inquired about the price. This was different. She glanced back at Elysium, then at him. "Everything is chaos trying to find order, or maybe the other way around." Khalid chuckled, a rich, genuine sound. "I see. Chaos in gold, order in blue, a dance of opposites." The weight of his attention felt intoxicating. Sophie had spent years fighting to be noticed, to have her art seen for what it was, rather than dismissed as pretty but decorative. Yet in mere minutes, this stranger made her feel understood. "Forgive me," Khalid continued, extending his hand. "I should introduce myself. Khalid al-Mansour. I'm in town on business, but this," he gestured to the painting, "feels more important than anything I've seen all week." Sophie shook his hand, her grip firm despite her racing pulse. "Sophie Ellington, and thank you. That's kind of you to say." Khalid's lips curved into a subtle smile. "It's not kindness, it's honesty. Your work deserves the world stage, not just this room." The compliment hung in the air, heavy with implication. Sophie wanted to bask in it, but doubt crept in like an uninvited guest. She barely managed her rent. What stage could she possibly belong to? "Tell me," Khalid interrupted her thoughts. "Do you often paint to escape, or is it the act of creation itself that grounds you?" "Both, I think," Sophie admitted, surprised by her own candor. "It's like breathing. I can't not do it." His eyes narrowed slightly, as if analyzing her words. "And what if you didn't have to fight for it? What if the struggle could disappear?" Sophie frowned, unsure of where he was leading. "I don't think art works that way. The struggle is part of the process." Khalid nodded thoughtfully but said nothing more, leaving her to ponder the weight of his silence. Moments later, an assistant interrupted to call his attention to another part of the gallery, but not before he turned back to her. "Your chaos, your order, they're remarkable, Sophie. I'd like to see more." He slipped a business card into her hand, his fingers brushing hers for a fleeting second. "Reach out. There's much more to discuss." As Khalid walked away, the room felt colder somehow, his absence palpable. Sophie clutched the card in her hand, the edges digging into her palm. It was only then she noticed the faint scent of oud lingering in the air, earthy, rich, and completely foreign. She couldn't help but wonder, had she just met an admirer, or something much more dangerous? The clink of fine china echoed in the intimate corner of the restaurant where Khalid and Sophie sat. Candlelight flickered between them, casting shadows across Khalid's sharp features. Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that she was living someone else's life, a far cry from her usual existence of late-night painting and take-out dinners. "You seem distracted," Khalid observed, his voice smooth as velvet. His dark eyes searched hers, and Sophie felt a flush of embarrassment. "I'm just overwhelmed," she admitted. "This week has been a whirlwind." "You've captured the attention of the right people, including me," Khalid said with a subtle smile. He leaned forward, his intensity palpable. "Sophie, I see potential in you, a future far brighter than you seem to imagine for yourself." Sophie hesitated. Compliments from Khalid felt different, heavier. They lingered like unspoken promises, but there was always something unplaceable beneath his words. Before she could respond, he reached into his jacket pocket and produced a small velvet box. Her breath caught. "Khalid, what?" He opened it to reveal a diamond ring glittering under the candlelight like a piece of frozen starlight. The restaurant seemed to blur around her, The murmurs of other patrons faded into silence. "Sophie Ellington," Khalid began, his tone deepening, "I want you to be my wife, to share my life, my world, and let me share yours." Sophie's hands trembled as she stared at the ring. Marriage? Her mind raced. 3 months ago she had been struggling to pay for canvases. Now this man, this magnetic, enigmatic man, was offering her everything she'd never dared to dream of. "Khalid, it's so sudden," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Life is too fleeting for hesitation," Khalid countered. "You deserve to live without limits, without struggle. With me, your art will reach audiences you've only dreamed of. I want to build that life with you." His words hung in the air, shimmering with promise. But Sophie couldn't ignore the subtle shift in his tone, a quiet expectation woven into his plea. "I need time to think," she said cautiously, her eyes meeting his. "This is a big decision." Khalid nodded, though his jaw tightened slightly. "I understand. But Sophie, know this. With me, you'll never have to face the chaos alone. I will protect you, guide you, give you stability." The word stability felt both reassuring and suffocating. Sophie nodded, overwhelmed but unwilling to make a rash decision. Yet a part of her couldn't shake the allure of leaving behind her struggles. The next day, Khalid invited her to his penthouse suite. It was a world away from her modest studio apartment, sleek, modern, and impossibly luxurious. As she marveled at the view of the city below, Khalid stepped closer. "This could be your life, Sophie," he said, gesturing to the opulence around them. "But there's something you need to understand." Her heart skipped. "What do you mean?" "My world, it comes with traditions, expectations," Khalid explained, his tone firm but gentle. "I am a man of honor, bound by my family and culture. You would be my partner, yes, but also my wife, a role that carries responsibilities." Sophie's chest tightened. "Responsibilities?" Khalid's expression softened, but his words did not. "Respect for my customs, dedication to our home, and the willingness to adapt. Are you willing to embrace that, Sophie?" She struggled to process his words. The image of her painting in a sunlit studio began to flicker, replaced by something far more structured. "I don't know if I'm—" "You don't have to answer now," Khalid interrupted, stepping closer. "But I want you to think about it. Truly think. Together, we could create something extraordinary." Sophie looked out the window, the city lights blurring as her thoughts swirled. Was she ready to give up her independence for a life she couldn't yet fully grasp? And why did Khalid's words feel like both a promise and a warning? The air in Riyadh was different, thicker, warmer, and heavy with a sense of stillness Sophie couldn't quite place. The grandeur of Khalid's mansion overwhelmed her as they stepped inside for the first time. Massive marble pillars loomed over a sprawling atrium, adorned with gold accents that caught the sunlight streaming through arched windows. Yet, for all its magnificence, the house felt eerily silent, as though sound itself was swallowed by the sheer vastness of the space. Khalid led her through a labyrinth of hallways, each more lavish than the last. When he opened the door to what he called her room, Sophie's breath caught. The suite was enormous, with plush furniture, ornate rugs, and a balcony overlooking the desert horizon. At the center of it all stood an easel and a set of paints arranged with meticulous precision. "I wanted to give you a space to create," Khalid said, his voice low. "You've left your mark on me, Sophie. I hope this inspires you to leave it here as well." Sophie turned to him, her emotions tangled. The gesture was thoughtful, yet there was something deliberate about it, like an offering meant to distract her from the unsettling reality of her new world. She forced a smile, nodding in gratitude. "Thank you, Khalid, it's beautiful." As days turned into weeks, Sophie began to adjust to life in the mansion, but not without challenges. Khalid's schedule often kept him away, leaving her alone in a house that felt more like a museum than a home. She wandered its halls, marveling at the sheer opulence yet feeling an undercurrent of isolation. The staff, though polite, kept their distance, speaking only when spoken to. One morning, Sophie decided to paint. She set up her easel on the balcony, letting the desert's vastness serve as her muse. As her brush glided over the canvas, the weight in her chest began to lift, until a shadow fell across her work. Khalid stood behind her, his expression unreadable. "What are you painting?" Sophie turned the easel slightly, revealing an abstract landscape, a swirl of red and gold with streaks of blue cutting through the chaos. Khalid's brow furrowed. "It's bold," he said, his tone measured, But I wonder if such chaos belongs in this house. Her heart sank. It's just a reflection of how I feel. Art doesn't always have to belong. Khalid studied her for a long moment before stepping away. Perhaps. But remember, Sophie, this house isn't just yours. Everything here, including your art, represents our union. The words lingered long after he left. Sophie's hands trembled as she picked up her brush again, but the colors no longer felt like hers. For the first time, she hesitated before adding another stroke. That evening, Khalid introduced her to his mother, Amina, a regal woman whose presence filled the room. Amina's gaze swept over Sophie with quiet judgment, her lips forming a thin line. "So this is the artist," Amina said, her tone sharp. "Tell me, Sophie, do you intend to contribute to this family in other ways, or will your art suffice?" Sophie's cheeks flushed, but Khalid stepped in before she could respond. "Mother, Sophie is adjusting. She will find her place here." Amina's eyes narrowed slightly. "She'll need to, Khalid. A wife's duty is to support her husband, not to indulge in frivolities." The word struck Sophie like a slap. Frivolities? Her art had always been her lifeline, her identity. But here, in this golden prison, it was being stripped of meaning. As the days passed, Sophie began noticing small changes. Her art supplies were moved without her consent, and certain pieces she'd started mysteriously disappeared. When she asked the staff, they avoided her gaze, mumbling excuses. Her room, once a haven, now felt like a cage, beautiful but confining. One night she confronted Khalid. "Why are my paintings being moved? I thought this was my space." Khalid's expression hardened. "Your space is part of this house, Sophie, and this house is a reflection of me. What you create here must align with that." Sophie stared at him, her chest tightening. "You told me I could create freely." "And you can," he replied evenly, within reason. In that moment, Sophie realized the depth of her predicament. The freedom Khalid had promised was an illusion, like the gilded bars of her new home. She was not just a wife in this house. She was an extension of Khalid's image, a piece of his carefully curated world, and she didn't belong to herself anymore. The morning sun poured through the arched windows, but Sophie's energy felt sapped before the day had even begun. The previous night's confrontation with Khalid lingered in her mind like a stubborn stain, his calm but chilling words looping over and over. She couldn't shake the feeling that her freedoms were slipping through her fingers, like grains of desert sand. The distant chime of the mansion's clock reminded Sophie of the time. She hurried to the kitchen, her steps echoing through the quiet halls. Khalid had requested breakfast in the garden, a small but manageable task. At least that's what she thought. The kitchen staff glanced at her warily as she entered, their hushed voices falling silent. Sophie ignored their stares and began preparing the tray herself. She was determined to reclaim some semblance of control, even in the simplest of ways. By the time she carried the tray outside, Khalid was already seated at the garden table, the air around him as composed as ever. His phone rested beside him, glowing faintly with unread messages. Sophie set the tray down carefully, her pulse quickening when she noticed his furrowed brow. "You're late," he said, not looking up. Sophie blinked. "It's only 5 minutes." Khalid's gaze lifted, sharp and deliberate. 5 minutes sets a tone for the day, Sophie. It suggests carelessness, and carelessness has no place in this household. Her cheeks burned with a mix of embarrassment and frustration. "I didn't mean to—" "Intentions don't matter," he interrupted, his tone clipped. "What matters is execution." The words cut deeper than Sophie expected. She had always prided herself on her independence, her ability to adapt and thrive. Now she felt reduced to a child being scolded for a minor mistake. She bit her lip, willing herself not to react. Khalid sighed, pushing the tray aside. "As my wife, your responsibilities extend beyond yourself. This isn't about breakfast, it's about respect. And if you cannot respect your duties, there will be consequences." Sophie's stomach churned. What kind of consequences? His silence spoke volumes. The rest of the day passed in a blur of tension. Sophie returned to her room, her appetite gone, the untouched breakfast tray still vivid in her memory. By lunchtime her stomach growled, but no food appeared. The hours stretched on, and by evening her hunger had transformed into a gnawing ache. When she finally ventured downstairs, Khalid was in the sitting room, reading a leather-bound book as though nothing had happened. She hesitated in the doorway, her voice trembling as she asked, "Am I not allowed to eat today?" Khalid looked up, his expression calm but unyielding. "This is not a punishment, Sophie, it's a lesson. Respect is not a one-sided endeavor." "A lesson?" Sophie's voice cracked. By starving me? You exaggerate, Khalid replied, his tone unnervingly even. One missed meal is hardly starvation. It's an opportunity to reflect. Her chest tightened with anger and disbelief. I don't need reflection, I need respect, Khalid, mutual respect. And you'll have it, he said, setting his book aside, when it's earned. The words struck her like a physical blow. Sophie turned on her heel and left, her vision blurring with unshed tears. The mansion's corridors felt colder, the walls closing in around her, as she retreated to the safety of her room. That night she sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the untouched canvas on her easel. The urge to paint was there, but her hands felt heavy, her mind too clouded with anger and exhaustion. She picked up her journal instead, the pen trembling in her grasp. I gave up everything to be here, but it feels like I've given away myself, she wrote, the ink smudging as a tear splashed onto the page. How did I not see the bars of this cage before I stepped inside? As the night deepened, Sophie lay awake, her body weak with hunger and her mind racing with questions she couldn't answer. For the first time, she wondered if Khalid's promises of love and stability were nothing more than a beautifully wrapped trap, and if she'd ever find the strength to escape it. The mansion's corridors stretched endlessly, each turn identical to the last. Sophie walked aimlessly, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpets that lined the marble floors. Every hallway was adorned with intricate gold accents, but their shine had dulled in her eyes. The grandeur of the house no longer impressed her, it felt suffocating. The air seemed heavier today, pressing down on her with a sense of unease she couldn't shake. As she turned a corner, Sophie noticed a door she hadn't seen before. It was tucked away at the far end of the hallway, its dark wooden surface unadorned. Unlike the other doors in the mansion, which were grand and welcoming, this one was stark, almost hidden. Sophie's curiosity flared, cutting through the monotony of her day. She reached for the handle, only to find it locked. Her brow furrowed. Why would a door in her own home be locked? Later that evening, during dinner, she decided to ask Khalid. He was seated at the head of the table, his presence as commanding as ever. The conversation was polite but shallow, and Sophie waited for a moment when the staff had left the room. Khalid, she began cautiously, setting her fork down. There's a locked door at the end of the west hallway. What's inside? Khalid's hand paused mid-air, the wineglass inches from his lips. His gaze darkened as he placed the glass down slowly, the tension in the room thickening. That room is not your concern, Sophie. His tone was final, but Sophie pressed on. It's just odd. Every other door in the house is open, but that one... I said it's not your concern. His voice was sharper now, cutting through her words. The air between them grew cold, and Sophie felt the weight of his authority pressing down on her. She lowered her gaze, silently cursing herself for asking. The following days passed uneventfully, but the locked door lingered in Sophie's thoughts like an itch she couldn't scratch. Why had Khalid reacted so strongly? What could possibly be behind that door? Her curiosity grew into an obsession, consuming her every waking moment. One afternoon, while Khalid was away on business, Sophie decided to explore. The mansion was eerily quiet, the staff busying themselves in the far wings. Sophie approached the locked door again, her heart pounding. This time she noticed something new, a faint scratch along the edge of the frame, as if someone had tried to force it open before. Madame? A voice startled her. Sophie turned to see Rashid, the quiet but observant servant who seemed to always appear at the right time. His gaze flickered to the door, then back to her. You shouldn't linger here. Why not? Sophie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. It's for your safety, Rashid replied, his tone low. There are things in this house better left undisturbed. But Rashid's words only fueled her curiosity. Later that evening, she caught him in the kitchen and pressed him further. After much hesitation, Rashid finally relented, his voice barely audible over the hum of the appliances. There was someone before you, he said, his eyes darting nervously. A woman. She lived here, in your place. Sophie's blood ran cold. What happened to her? Rashid hesitated, then shook his head. I can't say, but whatever you do, don't ask Khalid. He doesn't forgive questions. That night, Sophie couldn't sleep. Her mind raced with possibilities, each more sinister than the last. Was the locked room connected to this mysterious woman? And why had Rashid been so cryptic? Her fear and curiosity battled within her, but one thing was certain. She couldn't ignore the door any longer. The next morning, Sophie returned to the hallway determined. To her surprise, the door was slightly ajar. Her breath hitched as she pushed it open, the hinges creaking loudly in the silence. Inside, the air was stale, carrying the scent of neglect. The room was small and bare, save for a single trunk in the corner. Sophie approached it cautiously, her fingers trembling as she unlatched the lid. Inside were letters, photographs, and personal belongings, a life neatly packed away and forgotten. One photograph caught her eye, a young woman with soft features and a melancholic smile. On the back, in neat handwriting, was a single name, Zara. Sophie clutched the photo, her heart racing. Whoever Zara was, her presence in this house had been erased except for this room, and Sophie had the sinking feeling she was about to uncover why. Sophie's hand trembled as she set the photograph of Zara back into the trunk. The woman's faint smile seemed to mock her, as if Zara already knew the truth Sophie was only beginning to suspect. The questions in her mind were endless. Who was Zara? What had happened to her? And why had Khalid hidden her existence? Sophie barely noticed the sweat forming on her palms as she closed the trunk and hurried out of the room, her heart racing. By the time she reached her room, Rashid was waiting just outside her door. His expression was tense, his eyes darting down the corridor. Sophie froze, unsure of what to say. "Madam," he whispered urgently, Did you go inside?" Sophie nodded, clutching her hands together to steady herself. "Who is Zara, Rashid? Why is her name nowhere in this house?" Rashid glanced over his shoulder, then stepped inside her room and closed the door. "You shouldn't have gone there," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "If Khalid finds out—" "Tell me!" Sophie demanded, her voice shaking. "I deserve to know." Rashid sighed heavily, his shoulders slumping. "Zara was his first wife. She lived here before you, and for a time, she believed the same promises Khalid made to you." Sophie felt the blood drain from her face. "What happened to her?" Rashid hesitated, but the sorrow in his eyes was answer enough. "She vanished," he said finally. "One day she was gone and no one spoke of her again, but I—" He stopped, his voice breaking. "You what?" Sophie pressed, her fear now laced with desperation. "I found her journal, buried in the garden," Rashid confessed. "She wrote about wanting to escape, but she was afraid Khalid wouldn't let her leave. There were bruises, madam, and threats." Sophie's stomach churned, bile rising in her throat. She sank into the nearest chair, her mind reeling. Could Khalid really be capable of such cruelty? The man who had once seemed so kind, so devoted. But deep down, Sophie already knew the answer. She had seen the warning signs, the controlling rules, the punishments disguised as lessons, and now with Zara's story those signs loomed larger, more sinister. "I need to see that journal," Sophie said, her voice barely above a whisper. Rashid shook his head, his expression grave. "It's gone. Khalid destroyed it when he found out I had it. But I remember some of what she wrote, especially the part about her fears. She believed Khalid's wealth wasn't just for show. He uses it to control people, to silence them." Sophie felt the weight of Rashid's words pressing down on her chest. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because you need to understand what you're dealing with," Rashid said. "Khalid isn't just your husband. He's a man who doesn't tolerate disobedience. And if he suspects you're looking for answers—" He trailed off, but his meaning was clear. For the first time, Sophie truly felt the extent of her entrapment. She wasn't just a wife in a stifling marriage. She was a pawn in Khalid's meticulously controlled world. And if Zara's story was any indication, Khalid didn't let his pawns leave the game. That evening, as Sophie sat alone in her room, she replayed Rashid's words in her mind. Her instincts screamed at her to confront Khalid, to demand the truth, but her fear held her back. Instead, she decided to test the boundaries of his control. When Khalid returned home that night, Sophie greeted him with a calm demeanor, masking the storm inside her. Over dinner, she asked about his day, her voice steady despite her racing pulse. Khalid seemed pleased by her interest. His own demeanor relaxed. But when she casually mentioned exploring the mansion earlier, his expression darkened. "What did you find?" he asked sharply, his fork clattering against his plate. "Nothing," Sophie lied, her heart pounding. "Just more rooms." Khalid's gaze lingered on her for a moment too long, his silence unnerving. Then he smiled, but the warmth didn't reach his eyes. "Good," he said. "It's best to keep things simple, Sophie. Curiosity can lead to misunderstandings." The warning in his words was clear. Sophie forced a smile, her stomach twisting. She knew now that Khalid was watching her more closely than she had realized, and that if she wasn't careful, her fate might mirror Zara's. That night, as Sophie lay in bed staring at the ceiling, one thought consumed her. If Zara couldn't escape, how could she? The mansion was unnervingly quiet that afternoon, its halls cloaked in the heavy stillness that Sophie had come to dread. Khalid was away for a business meeting, and most of the staff had retreated to the servant quarters. For the first time in days, Sophie felt the faintest flicker of hope, a chance to act without eyes constantly watching her. Rashid had slipped a piece of paper into her hand earlier that morning, his usual expression unreadable. Now, in the solitude of her room, Sophie unfolded it carefully. Scrawled in shaky handwriting was a simple message: "Back gate, 4 p.m. Her pulse quickened. She knew the risks. If Khalid discovered her attempt to leave, the consequences could be far worse than the punishment for a late breakfast or misplaced curiosity. But staying in this house, in this life, felt like slow suffocation. She needed to escape, no matter the cost. The minutes crawled by as Sophie packed a small bag, taking only essentials: a few clothes, her journal, and the photograph of Zara. She tucked the photo carefully into a side pocket, as if Zara's faint smile might somehow guide her to safety. The weight of her decision pressed heavily on her chest, but she forced herself to move. At precisely 4 o'clock, Sophie slipped into the hallway, her footsteps light against the polished floors. Every shadow seemed alive, every distant sound amplified in her mind. Her heart thundered as she navigated the labyrinthine corridors, each turn bringing her closer to freedom or discovery. When she reached the back gate, Rashid was waiting, his face pale and drawn. He handed her a simple scarf, motioning for her to cover her hair. "There's a car waiting just beyond the service road," he whispered. "It will take you to the city." Sophie nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice breaking. "I don't know how to—" "Don't thank me yet," Rashid interrupted, his gaze darting nervously toward the mansion. "Just go, quickly." She stepped through the gate, the cool metal brushing her arm as it swung shut behind her. The air beyond felt different, lighter, freer, but her relief was short-lived. Before she could take another step, a sharp voice rang out. "Where do you think you're going?" Sophie froze. Khalid stood a few feet away, his expression a mask of calm fury. The shadows of the tall walls stretched around him, making him appear larger, more menacing. Sophie's throat went dry as she clutched her bag tighter, her mind racing for an explanation. She stammered, her voice barely audible. "I needed air." Khalid's eyes narrowed. "Air? Beyond the walls of this house? Without my knowledge?" Behind him, Rashid shifted uncomfortably, his gaze fixed on the ground. Khalid noticed the movement, his anger redirecting. "You!" he barked, pointing at Rashid. "Did you know about this?" Rashid hesitated, his silence betraying him. Khalid's face darkened. "Of course you did. You think betrayal earns you forgiveness?" "No," Sophie said, her voice rising as panic overtook her. "It wasn't his fault. Enough," Khalid snapped, his voice cutting through her protest. He turned to Rashid. "Leave us." Rashid opened his mouth to speak, but Khalid's glare silenced him. With a reluctant nod, he disappeared back through the gate, leaving Sophie alone with Khalid. The tension between them was suffocating. Khalid stepped closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "I have given you everything, Sophie," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "And this is how you repay me?" "Everything?" Sophie shot back, her fear momentarily overshadowed by anger. "You've given me a prison." Khalid's expression hardened. "Careful, Sophie. Words like that have consequences." Sophie's defiance faltered as Khalid grabbed her bag, ripping it open. The photograph of Zara slipped out, fluttering to the ground like a fallen leaf. Khalid's gaze landed on it, his jaw tightening. "So," he murmured, his tone icy, "you've been digging where you don't belong." Sophie didn't respond, her chest tightening as he stepped closer, holding the photograph up between them. "You think you can escape, Sophie? That you can simply walk away?" His words cut deep, but Sophie forced herself to meet his gaze. "I have to try." Khalid's laughter was cold, devoid of humor. "You'll learn, my dear. No one leaves this house without my permission." As the gate clanged shut behind them, Sophie felt the weight of her failure settle heavily on her shoulders. Freedom had seemed so close, just a few steps beyond the gate, but now it felt further away than ever. Sophie's failure to escape clung to her like a shadow, ever present and suffocating. Days passed in tense silence. Khalid's demeanor remained calm but cold, his anger simmering beneath the surface. He never spoke of the incident at the gate, but his watchful eyes followed her every move. The mansion, once oppressively quiet, now felt charged with unspoken threats. Rashid avoided her completely. His absence stung, but Sophie understood. He had risked everything to help her, and now he was paying the price. The staff, already distant, treated her with even more caution, their whispers growing quieter whenever she entered a room. Late one evening, Sophie wandered the hallways, unable to sleep. Her steps took her past the locked room, the sight of its heavy wooden door reigniting her curiosity. She had tried to bury her questions about Zara, but they refused to stay silent. Khalid's reaction to the photograph haunted her, the way his hand had tightened around it, his voice sharp with unspoken meaning. What did he know? What was he hiding? The door creaked slightly as Sophie brushed her fingers against it. She had no plan, no clear idea of what she hoped to achieve, but her desperation for answers outweighed her caution. She pressed her ear to the door, her breath catching as faint voices reached her from the other side. "Too much," one voice said, muffled but stern. It was Khalid. "She doesn't know," another voice replied, quieter, almost pleading. "But if she finds out—" "She won't," Khalid snapped. "And neither will anyone else. Do you understand?" Sophie's heart raced. Who was Khalid speaking to? And what was it that she wasn't supposed to know? Her mind filled with possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. She backed away from the door, her pulse hammering in her ears. The next morning, Sophie resolved to confront Rashid. He was in the kitchen, scrubbing dishes with mechanical precision, his face drawn and tired. She waited until the other staff left before stepping inside. "Rashid," she said quietly. He didn't look up. "Madam, please," he murmured. "I can't speak to you." "You have to," Sophie insisted, her voice trembling. "I heard Khalid talking last night. He's hiding something about Zara. Please, Rashid, I need to know the truth." Rashid hesitated, his hands pausing mid-scrub. For a moment Sophie thought he might refuse. Then he sighed heavily, setting the dish aside. "You shouldn't ask these questions," he said, his tone heavy with warning. "They won't lead to anything good." "I don't care," Sophie said, her voice firm despite her fear. "I need to know what happened to her. I need to know what Khalid is capable of." Rashid glanced around the empty kitchen before leaning closer. "Zara. She wanted to leave," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "She was unhappy, like you are. But Khalid, he doesn't let go easily. She tried to escape just like you." Sophie's stomach turned. "And then what?" "She disappeared," Rashid said simply. "No one knows where she went or if she's even still alive. But there were rumors, whispers among the staff. They said Khalid had her removed." The word hung in the air, heavy and ominous. Sophie's knees felt weak, and she gripped the edge of the counter to steady herself. "You mean he—" "I don't know," Rashid interrupted, his voice pained. "But I know this. Khalid is dangerous, and if he thinks you know too much, he won't hesitate to make you disappear too." The weight of Rashid's words settled over Sophie like a shroud. The photograph of Zara, the locked room, Khalid's veiled threats, it all pointed to something dark, something far more sinister than she had imagined. That evening, Sophie sat in her room, staring at the photograph of Zara. The woman's soft smile seemed to mock her, a reminder of what could be lost. Sophie clenched the photo tightly, her resolve hardening. Khalid might control the walls of this house, but he wouldn't control her spirit. She would uncover the truth, no matter the cost. As the night deepened, Sophie made a silent vow. She would not end up like Zara. She would find a way to escape, and this time she would succeed. Sophie sat on the edge of her bed, her thoughts racing as the first rays of dawn crept through the curtains. Rashid's warning replayed in her mind, each word cutting deeper. Zara's disappearance was no longer a mystery. It was a threat, looming over her like a storm cloud. Sophie had one conclusion. She couldn't wait for Khalid to act. She had to leave, and this time she couldn't afford to fail. Her fingers trembled as she dialed Eliza's number on the burner phone Rashid had slipped her weeks ago. The line buzzed twice before Eliza's voice came through, groggy but alert. "Sophie?" Eliza's voice softened, tinged with worry. "What's wrong?" "I need your help," Sophie whispered, her voice shaking. "I need to get out of here." Eliza didn't hesitate. "Where are you?" "In the mansion," Sophie replied. Her words rushed. "But it's not that simple. Khalid, he knows everything, and if he finds out—" "He won't," Eliza interrupted firmly. "I'll figure something out. Give me a day." A flicker of hope lit within Sophie, but it was quickly tempered by fear. She ended the call and slipped the phone back into its hiding place. Her mind spun with possibilities, every scenario ending in disaster, but this time she had no choice. It was freedom or nothing. Later that day, Rashid appeared in the garden where Sophie pretended to sketch. He walked past her with a tray of tea, his movements deliberate. As he set the tray on the table, he whispered, "Tonight, midnight." Sophie nodded imperceptibly, her heart pounding. The weight of the plan settled over her, suffocating yet exhilarating. She spent the rest of the day preparing, every moment a balancing act between composure and panic. She packed her bag with the essentials once more, each item a lifeline to the world beyond these walls. When midnight arrived, the mansion was silent. Sophie crept through the corridors, her footsteps ghost-like against the cool marble. Her senses were heightened, every sound amplified in the stillness. She reached the back gate where Rashid waited, his face tense with urgency. "This way," he murmured, leading her to a service road hidden behind thick hedges. A car waited, its engine softly idling. Rashid opened the door, glancing over his shoulder. "Go! Quickly!" Sophie hesitated, her gaze locking with his. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I'll never forget this." Rashid gave a tight nod, his eyes betraying the fear he tried to suppress. "Go," he repeated. Sophie climbed into the car, her pulse racing as the driver accelerated down the narrow road. The mansion disappeared into the darkness behind her, and for the first time in months, she felt a sliver of relief. She leaned back against the seat, her body trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline. But the relief was short-lived. As the car reached the main road, the driver glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "Where to, ma'am?" he asked. "Anywhere," Sophie said breathlessly. "As far from here as possible." The driver nodded, but his hands tightened on the wheel, his movements deliberate. Sophie's unease grew as she noticed the faint glow of headlights behind them, drawing closer. She turned to look out the rear window, her stomach twisting as she recognized the car's shape. It was Khalid's. "Drive faster," she urged, her voice rising. "I can't," the driver said, his voice flat. "They'll catch us either way." Sophie's heart sank as realization dawned. The driver wasn't helping her. He was working for Khalid. The car slowed to a stop, and before Sophie could react, the doors locked with a sharp click. The vehicle behind them pulled up, and Khalid stepped out, his silhouette framed by the blinding headlights. His expression was calm, but his eyes burned with quiet fury. He opened the door and extended a hand. "Come," he said, his voice cold. "We have much to discuss." Sophie's body refused to move, paralyzed by fear and defeat. Khalid leaned closer, his tone softening but losing none of its menace. "You've disappointed me, Sophie, but I'm a forgiving man. Come back and we'll put this behind us." Tears blurred Sophie's vision as she stepped out of the car, her legs weak beneath her. Khalid's hand closed around hers, firm but unyielding, as he guided her back toward the car. Her desperate plan had failed. Again. And this time the cost of failure felt far greater. The silence in the room was suffocating. Sophie sat stiffly in one of the ornate chairs in Khalid's study, the dim light from the overhead chandelier casting sharp shadows across the polished wood. Khalid stood by the window, his back to her, his posture rigid. Outside, the desert night stretched endlessly, a reflection of the void Sophie felt growing between them. "You've been busy," Khalid finally said, his voice low but sharp. It wasn't a question, it was an accusation. Sophie's hands tightened around the arms of the chair. "You can't keep me here, Khalid. You can't control me." Khalid turned, his expression calm, but his eyes burning with quiet fury. "Control? Is that what you think this is? I've given you everything, Sophie. A life most women would envy, and yet you betray me." "Betray you?" Sophie stood, her voice rising. "You've turned this house into a prison. You punish me for the smallest mistakes. You hide the truth about Zara, and you call this love?" Khalid's jaw tightened at the mention of Zara's name. "Be careful," he warned, his voice dangerously soft. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Then tell me," Sophie shouted, the words spilling out before she could stop herself. "What happened to her, Khalid? What are you so desperate to hide?" The tension in the room thickened. Khalid's eyes darkened as he took a step closer, his presence overwhelming. "You want the truth?" he said, his voice laced with menace. "Fine. Zara was weak. She thought she could defy me, that she could leave. She was wrong." Sophie's breath caught, her stomach twisting in horror. You hurt her?" Khalid's expression didn't waver. "She made her choice, Sophie, just as you're making yours now. But understand this, there are consequences for every action." The weight of his words settled over her like a shroud. Sophie felt her resolve faltering, her fear clawing at the edges of her mind, but she refused to let him see it. "You don't scare me," she said, her voice trembling but defiant. A cold smile curved Khalid's lips. "You should be scared. You should understand what happens when people forget their place." "I won't live like this," Sophie said, her voice firm despite the tears welling in her eyes. "I'm not Zara. You can't break me." Khalid's smile faded, replaced by a flicker of something Sophie couldn't quite place. Anger, perhaps, or maybe regret. He stepped back, his gaze piercing. "You think you're different," he said quietly, "but you'll learn. Everyone does." Sophie's chest tightened as he walked to the door, his hand pausing on the handle. "This conversation is over," he said, his tone final. "You'll stay in your room until I decide what happens next." The door closed behind him with a resounding click, leaving Sophie alone in the oppressive silence. She sank back into the chair, her body trembling with a mix of fear and fury. She hated him for what he had done to Zara, for what he was trying to do to her, but most of all she hated herself for not knowing how to fight back. As the hours passed, Sophie's anger crystallized into resolve. She wouldn't let Khalid win. She wouldn't let herself disappear like Zara. There had to be a way out of this, a way to reclaim her freedom, and she would find it, no matter the cost. The night was thick with silence, the kind that carried an edge of foreboding. Sophie stood by her window, staring out at the dark desert beyond the estate's high walls. Her chest tightened with the weight of her plan, a fragile thread of hope that, if snapped, could cost her everything. But she had made her choice. There was no turning back. Rashid had slipped her a key earlier that day, his face pale and his voice strained. "This will get you out through the service gate," he whispered, "but you'll have to time it perfectly. The guards make their rounds every half hour." Sophie had nodded, unable to speak. Rashid was risking his life for her, and she couldn't afford to let his courage go to waste. Now, as the clock ticked closer to midnight, she readied herself. She packed a small bag, her hands trembling as she zipped it shut. The photograph of Zara rested inside, a reminder of what was at stake. Sophie closed her eyes, willing herself to be calm. When the mansion's clocks chimed 12, Sophie slipped into the hallway. The air was cool and the faint scent of oud lingered, a reminder of Khalid's ever-present shadow. She moved quickly but silently, her ears straining for any sound that might betray her. She reached the service gate, her heart pounding as she inserted the key. The lock clicked open and Sophie pushed the gate just enough to slip through. The night air hit her like a jolt, sharp and freeing. For a brief moment she allowed herself to hope. A black SUV idled a few feet away, just as Rashid had promised. She climbed into the back seat, her breaths shallow as the driver pulled away. The mansion disappeared behind her, its golden lights fading into the distance. Sophie leaned back, closing her eyes. She was free, or so she thought. "Where do you want to go?" the driver asked, his voice calm. "Anywhere," Sophie replied, her voice shaking. "As far from here as possible." The driver nodded, and for several minutes the road stretched ahead in peaceful silence. But then Sophie noticed something. The headlights of another vehicle, steadily approaching from behind. Her stomach twisted. "Is someone following us?" she asked, her voice sharp. The driver glanced in the rearview mirror, his expression unreadable. "Stay calm," he said. "We'll handle it." But the words did little to comfort her. The pursuing car closed the distance quickly, and Sophie's pulse skyrocketed. Her mind raced with possibilities. Had Khalid already discovered her escape? Was this another trap? The SUV swerved suddenly, turning onto a narrow dirt road. The headlights behind them followed, their beams cutting through the darkness like knives. Sophie clutched the seat, her knuckles white. "What are you doing?" she demanded. "Trust me," the driver replied, his voice steady. "We're almost there." But Sophie couldn't bring herself to trust anyone. Not now. The SUV skidded to a stop near a small abandoned building. The driver turned to her, urgency in his eyes. "Run, now!" Sophie didn't hesitate. She grabbed her bag and bolted from the vehicle, her legs carrying her faster than she thought possible. She could hear the other car screeching to a halt behind her, voices shouting in a language she couldn't understand. Her lungs burned, but she didn't stop. The building loomed ahead, its shadowed doorway a beacon of safety. Sophie ducked inside, pressing herself against the cold wall. Her breaths came in short, ragged gasps as she listened to the chaos outside, footsteps, shouts, the slamming of car doors. And then, silence. Sophie's heart hammered in her chest. She waited, her body trembling until she was sure the danger had passed. Slowly she peeked outside. The cars were gone, the night once again still. She didn't know how long she could stay hidden, but for now, she was safe. As Sophie sank to the ground, exhaustion washing over her, she clutched the photograph of Zara. "I won't end like you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I promise." The promise echoed in the emptiness around her, a fragile vow that Sophie was determined to keep. The sun was just beginning to rise over the distant dunes as Sophie sat in the small, dimly lit room of the safe house. Her hands trembled as she adjusted the laptop on the table before her, its screen glowing faintly in the darkness. On the other end of the encrypted call, Eliza's voice came through, steady but urgent. "You've got everything?" Eliza asked, her tone sharp. "Yes," Sophie replied, her voice hoarse from exhaustion. "The files Rashid helped me copy, the photographs of the letters Khalid kept hidden. It's all here, but are you sure this will work?" Eliza hesitated for a moment. "It has to," she said. "These documents link him to illegal business deals and, Sophie, the bribes to silence Zara's family are damning. This will destroy him." Sophie swallowed hard, the weight of what she was about to do pressing on her chest. She had spent weeks collecting evidence, piecing together the truth Khalid had tried so hard to bury. Now, she was ready to expose him, but the fear of retaliation loomed large. Eliza's voice softened. "Once this goes public, Sophie, Khalid's power will crumble. He won't be able to touch you." Sophie nodded, even though Eliza couldn't see her. "Send it," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. With a single click, Sophie transmitted the files to a network of journalists and human rights organizations Eliza had contacted. The truth was out now, no longer confined to the walls of Khalid's mansion. Sophie leaned back in her chair, her breath shaky but determined. Hours later, the fallout began. The first reports appeared on international news outlets, headlines screaming accusations of corruption, abuse, and coercion. Sophie watched from the safety of the safe house as Khalid's carefully constructed image of power and respectability unraveled. Videos of protests outside his company's headquarters flooded social media, his name trending worldwide as the details of his crimes spread like wildfire. Khalid's reaction was swift and brutal. Sophie's phone buzzed incessantly with messages from unknown numbers, each more threatening than the last. But she was no longer the terrified woman trapped in his golden prison. She forwarded every message to Eliza, who passed them on to the authorities. One night, as Sophie sat in the safe house, the tension was shattered by a frantic knock at the door. She froze, her heart pounding. Rashid's voice called out from the other side, low but urgent. "Madam, it's me." Sophie opened the door to find Rashid pale and disheveled. "He knows it was you," Rashid said, his voice trembling. He's losing control. He's blaming everyone but his mother." Rashid paused, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "Amina has turned against him." Sophie stared at him, stunned. "What?" "She gave the authorities the rest of the documents," Rashid explained. "Bank records, contracts, everything. She said she wouldn't let him destroy what's left of their family." The revelation left Sophie breathless. Khalid's mother, the woman who had once been her harshest critic, had dealt the final blow. It was poetic justice in a way that Khalid's undoing came from within his own family. The news came days later. Khalid had been arrested at his private estate. The charges against him were staggering: money laundering, bribery, coercion, and more. Sophie watched the footage on her laptop, her hands trembling as she saw Khalid being led away in handcuffs. His face was stoic, but his eyes burned with a fury that sent a chill down her spine. For the first time in months, Sophie felt the weight on her chest begin to lift. Khalid's power was broken, his empire crumbling around him, but as she stared at the screen, she couldn't shake the lingering fear that he would find a way to strike back. Eliza's voice pulled her from her thoughts. "It's over, Sophie. You did it." Sophie nodded, her tears falling freely now. She had won, but the scars of her time with Khalid would take much longer to heal. As the sun rose higher over the desert, Sophie stepped outside the safe house, letting the warm breeze wash over her. For the first time in months, she felt the faintest glimmer of freedom. Khalid's fall was complete, but Sophie's journey to reclaim her life was only just beginning. Sophie stepped onto the balcony of her small apartment, her fingers wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee. The city buzzed below her, alive with the sounds of morning traffic and distant chatter. She inhaled deeply, letting the cool air fill her lungs, a sharp contrast to the stifling heat of the desert she had left behind. It had been 6 months since Khalid's arrest. 6 months since she had walked away from the mansion, from the shadows of Zara's tragedy, and from the prison that had nearly claimed her spirit. The scars of that time remained, etched into her memories and reflected in the art she now poured her soul into. But Sophie was learning how to live again, one day at a time. The gallery showing had been a success. Critics hailed her latest collection as raw and evocative, a reflection of survival and rebirth. Her most striking piece, a chaotic blend of blues and golds slashed with red, was titled "The Cage That Burned." It hung prominently in the center of the gallery, drawing both gasps and quiet contemplation. Eliza's voice pulled her from her thoughts. "Morning," she said, stepping out onto the balcony with a fresh croissant in hand. "You look lost in your head again." Sophie smiled faintly, setting her cup on the railing. "Just thinking." "About him?" Eliza asked carefully. "No," Sophie replied, shaking her head. "Not about him, about her." Eliza didn't need clarification. They had spoken often of Zara, of the woman who had come before, whose life had been erased but whose spirit had inspired Sophie to fight. "You did right by her, Sophie," Eliza said softly. "You made sure she wasn't forgotten." Sophie nodded, a lump rising in her throat. The weight of Zara's photograph still sat in her desk drawer, a silent reminder of everything she had endured and everything she had escaped. She hadn't been able to look at it since her first night in the safe house, but she knew it was there, waiting. "I just hope she knows," Sophie said quietly, her voice trembling, "wherever she is." Eliza placed a reassuring hand on Sophie's shoulder. "She does." As the morning sun climbed higher, Sophie felt a small but growing sense of peace. Her life wasn't perfect. There were still nightmares, moments of doubt, and an ache she couldn't quite name. But it was hers. Every decision, every step, every breath was her own. Sophie turned back toward the apartment, a sense of determination settling over her. There was a blank canvas waiting in the corner, and she was ready to fill it. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid of what the future might hold. She wasn't running anymore. She was free. What do you think of Sophie's journey and Khalid's actions? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Rate this story from 0 to 10. What's your score? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to follow all our stories. And be sure to check out more heart-pounding and heartwarming tales by clicking here on the end screen.